Tonight on Dateline.
When a murder is discovered.
And what you have is a young lady who is in a suitcase which has been deposited on a railway embankment and covered over by twigs and other foliage. How many cases of natural causes would end up with that scenario?
It doesn't just destroy one life.
And then you find out what really happened. You read it in books, you see it in TV shows and everything else. It's really tough. Well, there isn't a day go by that you don't remember something.
It tears communities apart.
When I arrived at the scene, the first thing I went and saw was the body in the wood.
It's up to the police to not only solve the mystery.
Homicides are the ultimate. That's the climax. That's what this job is all about.
And track down the killer, but bring them to justice.
Perhaps the most fascinating aspect of this case is that conviction was achieved without the body.
In this episode, a teenage boy is kicked to death on the street.
I couldn't understand why. Why would somebody do such a terrible thing?
Meet the murder detectives.
Each admitted that he'd seen the fight take place, but equally each denied that he'd taken part in the actual assault.
Who reveal how they caught the killer. In the tranquil Surrey Hills, an after-work night out for two brothers and their friend had ended in tragedy when one of them died in hospital following a fight with local youths.
I got the phone call. I was at home and I was planning this trip away down the Thames on a boat and packing and literally the phone rang and you just have to change your plans.
DCI Colin Sutton was appointed the senior investigating officer on the case.
The murder took place around about midnight on Friday going into Saturday. They told me the victim was only 18 years old, his name was Christopher Donovan, that it had been a fight in the street with another group of youths on a busy dual carriageway road, although it was late at night and there wasn't much traffic about, and that he had been in collision with a car after being assaulted.
The fight had also involved Christopher's brother, Philip. When police arrived at the scene, it was clear he was injured. Both young men were rushed to the local hospital, and officers were sent to contact their parents at home.
They said Chris has been involved in a fight, he's seriously injured. I thought it was a fight. And when I grabbed my car keys, he went, "No, we're driving you." They drove us down a 4-lane A road and that was closed. They got 4 lanes in the central reservation. Over the other side of the road were these policemen walking up and down, and this policeman in the car, the driver kept apologising, kept saying, "I'm sorry, we've got to go this way." I said, "I don't know what you're apologising for, we know, just get us to the hospital."
Dragged by a car presents us with another problem in the investigation because we were going to have to find out what had killed him. Was it the assault? Was it the accident with the car?
Cause of death in the UK is typically established by the pathologist during the post-mortem. This will involve looking at the remains or the body to assess any external factors, any evidence that is immediately visible.
The first thing the team needed to understand was exactly what had happened that night.
This was where the fight took place. So you've got the assailant group coming up the hill. Christopher, his brother, and the friend are walking down here, singing, ordinary Saturday evening, enjoying themselves.
And they were singing Champagne Supernova by Oasis. And as the groups came to pass each other on the footpath by the side of the road, one of the larger group said to the singers, "You've got the lyrics wrong." And that, it seems, was the trigger, that was the catalyst that sparked this fight.
It was what happened next that would determine what had been the cause of Christopher's death.
Christopher had been assaulted, he'd been punched and kicked, he'd been left in the road At the time of the assault, there's a set of traffic lights approximately 200 metres back along the road. The traffic had been held at red. Those had then changed to green. The traffic had started to move along. It's a dual carriageway, and unfortunately, the woman involved who was driving the car was absolutely distraught, but she had struck Christopher. She hadn't seen him initially, and by the time she realised he was in the carriageway, it was too late for her to stop.
At the crime scene, officers had secured the area and were searching for evidence that might help catch the killers.
They created a cordon with tape and officers to make sure that the area was kept sterile so that we could have the best chance of recovering scientific evidence.
If there's a crime scene without a great deal of evidence that's apparent there to the naked eye, I would imagine the investigation would turn much more to the body of the victim to try and understand, well, how was that victim murdered? But there's so many things that detectives would be thinking about doing, even if the crime scene appeared to not be revealing any clues in the first instance.
Less than 12 hours after the murder, on Saturday morning in Guildford Police Station, Colin set up a major incident room. He was treating this as a murder investigation.
The priorities, as I saw them, that were going to help us to solve this would have been the eyewitnesses. This was, although a busy road, it was essentially a residential area in quite a safe area where people would have been alerted by unusual noises and looked out, because that's human nature.
Officers had been taking names of local people since they had arrived at the scene.
There were a large number of witnesses. We had both members of the public who'd been driving along the road at the time, including, unfortunately, the lady who had struck Christopher. But the gist of what they were saying was that there was at least 3, possibly 4 assailants, who most of them saw kicking Christopher whilst he was in the road.
The investigation was just beginning, but for Christopher's parents, the cold reality of what had happened that night was now hitting home.
I can remember going home after that, after seeing Kristen, and thinking, oh my God, these people are on the streets. Who else are they going to hurt tonight? They've got to catch them quick. Please catch them quick.
That had ended in murder.
The case of Christopher Donovan was a particularly sad, tragic and upsetting case. It involved 3 young lads, Christopher, his brother Philip and a friend. They were walking just after midnight on a Friday night along the Yule bypass when they were attacked by another group who were unknown to them. As a result of the assaults, Christopher tragically lost his life and Philip was also assaulted.
Senior investigating officer Colin Sutton had assembled a team to find the killers. They were starting to piece together a picture of Friday night's events.
When I came here the day after Christopher was murdered, the first time I visited the scene, this was where I saw there were drag marks in the road. He'd been dragged by the car coming up the hill here. There were already flowers and tributes lying on these walls here. You see that this is now essentially a residential road. There's just lots of houses here. And although it's busy during the daytime, at night it wasn't so busy, and the noise of the fight had alerted many of the residents here, and they'd got to their windows and looked out. And that was going to be the start of how we investigated this and how we found Chris's killers, because we had many more eyewitnesses than we're used to when we're dealing with these sorts of crimes.
What the witnesses were telling us, as you'd expect, involved a certain amount of confusion because each of them had looked at it at a different time.
It's witnesses that are at the forefront of detectives' minds, and we can think of witnesses as meaning lots of different things. They obviously include eyewitnesses to the event or part of the fatal event, ear witnesses. They might include the paramedics that attended that might have vital information.
Where we had members of the public saying, I saw somebody wearing a certain amount of clothing and he was doing this, we had to give that information to the others that were speaking to other people, say, well, did you see somebody in a pink shirt? Did you see somebody in a hoop shirt? What was he doing? So we had to try and kind of build the picture and try and prompt in some ways the witnesses to make them recall just the small details about clothing and about what people had done, because it was clear that they were going to solve this for us.
As the team listened to all the descriptions of what residents had seen on Friday night, they came across their first real clues as to which people in the group had attacked Christopher.
Consistently amongst the varied accounts from the various witnesses, we were getting evidence of somebody wearing a pink polo shirt with a number on it, somebody wearing a hoop shirt with white trousers, another hoop shirt but definitely with dark trousers, and then somebody else in a dark jacket. And these were four kind of distinctive and distinct combinations of clothing that were being repeated time and again as we were speaking to witnesses. They were coming forward and saying that they'd seen this person wearing that clothing doing a certain act or kicking somebody or hitting somebody.
It was just as it appeared to be, a stupid, random interaction between two groups of youngsters.
By now, word was out in the local community of the events of that Friday night. Carolyn runs a shop in the Parade near where the fight broke out.
It was shocking at the time because it's just like a normal situation that really don't expect to happen, and it's so tragic. And you don't get an awful lot of punch-ups here. It's quite unusual. So to end like that is just dreadful.
Christopher's death was also reported on the local news, and Colin appealed for anyone with information to come forward.
On the Saturday afternoon, Saturday evening, somebody called the police and gave us a couple of names of people who they say had been involved in the fight, in the assailant group.
Following that initial call, the floodgates opened and more names started to be linked to the attackers. People wanted to help.
We had intelligence, we had people helping us and people saying, you need to look at this particular group, these particular individuals, because we think they're involved. But there's a big jump from thinking somebody's involved to being able to prove in a court that they were involved. And while we had people giving us names, we were going to rely on these people around here to give us the evidence to prove that they did it.
Colin decided he needed to contact some of these named suspects to see if he could link them to the attack.
So if they've been involved in a fight, you might actually have material under their fingernails or blood on their clothing or hair or fibres, something that will tie them to your victim. The decision was made to arrest these 2 or 3 young men on the Saturday night.
The suspects were all from the local area.
All the names that we'd received, all these people that we suspected, were young men who lived in and around this estate, most of them with their parents still. They were aged at the time between 16 and 20 years, had all been to school nearby, but none of them what you would call a career criminal or anybody who was a regular at the police station or regularly arrested.
It was only 24 hours after the attack. Colin asked a family liaison officer to visit Christopher's family and bring them up to date. A dawn raid was planned to bring them in.
The morning of the arrest, we had 5 separate teams who were making simultaneous raids on dwellings, houses and flats within this area. All the suspects were arrested simultaneously and searches made of the houses, and they were taken to separate police stations so that they could be questioned and we could try to establish what went on.
With suspects in custody, Colin and the team had a limited time to question them before they had to decide to charge them with murder.
By the time we got to Sunday morning and we had the team meeting on the Sunday morning, we've got the additional burden of having 3 prisoners in custody who need to be interviewed, who need to have their swabs and samples taken from them and all the other things that we do with major crime.
I suspect that they were looking to be able to find a connection between the suspects and either the scene of the crime or the victim. It was reported that this process was actually hindered because of the nature of the incident. So Christopher was not only attacked, but he was run over by a vehicle, and there was a level of interference with dirt and oil on the wheels and on the vehicle itself that prevented some of this analysis being conducted.
Although we took all the samples, we didn't find any forensic evidence from them. They, as is so common, were advised not to talk to us and say no comment when they were interviewed. We know we haven't got enough evidence to charge them at the moment. The only thing that we can sensibly do is to bail them to come back to the police station at a later date.
Colin and his team had now met 3 of the named youths: Stephen Andrews, Ryan Seymour, and an unnamed younger boy. But without concrete proof linking them to the killing, they had to release them again.
We sat down after they'd done the interviews to discuss what happened, and the general feeling amongst us all was that we were probably looking at the right group of people.
It was now a race to gather more evidence and bring Christopher's killers to justice.
I couldn't understand why. Why would somebody do such a terrible thing?
Learning was this was an attack that was both unnecessary and extremely violent. Christopher had been knocked to the floor, and then whilst he was on the floor, he'd been kicked a considerable number of times, and that was around the head and the upper body area.
28 witnesses in that street came forward. 28 witnesses. I never had so many witnesses to a murder case before.
It was headline news in the local paper. I still remember the boy's face in his school photo. So it did seem to hit the area. When people were sort of talking about it, it was thought it was just a punch-up gone wrong, really.
And it might not have been that they were the main aggressor. They may have struck the victim, they may have done something, but they won't feel like they are the main perpetrator. So I think there'll be people who are actually trying to be deceptive, and then there'll be the people who are so afraid, aren't really aware of what their role was, or don't feel that sense of responsibility.
Now increasingly sure they knew who the killers were, but without evidence to hold them, the police needed to be clear who had done what.
The evidence we were getting from the eyewitnesses was of a pretty sort of savage fight. No knives or guns or weapons, but hand-to-hand punching, kicking, people falling over, being punched to the ground, getting back up, carrying on.
Christopher had been the main recipient of the attack.
He was on the floor, adopted what appeared to be a fetal type position, and that they were repeatedly kicking him and also possibly stamping on him. The brutality was considerable.
This took place over a reasonably protracted time. It was going on for a whole minute. So we had pretty good information as to what went on and what was happening in the fight. And some of that information, to a greater or less degree, described what the people who took part were wearing. It came down to a problem of analysis, really. That it's something you do just by, as you might imagine, drawing up a matrix and saying, witness A says I saw this happening, and across the top you list the clothing. And so you end up with blue and white hooped T-shirt. Witness A says they saw him kick the man in the green jacket. Witness B said they saw him punch him. Witness C didn't see him do anything at all. And so on. And eventually you can build a sort of a composite story as to what must have gone on. By doing this analysis, we were able to kind of work out who had done what. But that who only related back to clothing. It didn't relate to an individual.
I think it takes a good detective to take those little nuggets of information from one witness or perhaps a number of witnesses and begin to connect them together. Different people have different bits of information because they've been out on a house-to-house inquiry, and it's so important to the SIO that people feed back information, and then it's the SIO's job with his senior team to sort of sit back and think, okay, what have we got here? Who else might we be able to speak to in that street that might have also heard something at 3 o'clock in the morning that might be important? So yeah, lots and lots of bringing together little tiny bits of information can paint the picture quite clearly.
The team had been searching the local area for CCTV cameras that might have caught the events of that Friday night, so they could put names to the descriptions.
We had CCTV images from the petrol station here, which came out across the forecourt. Although the petrol station was closed at the time, it was able to cover this footpath and just about the other side of the road. So we were able to identify the main part of the group as they'd walked towards the party.
When we looked at the CCTV from the SO garage, it just showed 3 young men. It didn't show the whole group. So we were kind of half the group missing. And that meant we had to cast the net more widely around here. And that resulted in my officers going to the station down at Stoneleigh and finding that half the group had actually been on the train, come back from Clapham Junction to Stoneleigh, and they'd met up down there where the party was taking place.
As the local community heard about the initial arrests, more information came into police that allowed them to further track the suspects' movements.
It was a phone call in from somebody who lived on the Watersedge estate where the bulk of the assailant group lived. And they said that 3 of them they knew had gone on the train to Clapham Junction to go and buy some speed, I think.
We had CCTV from the railway station. The group that had travelled by rail had then gone to a nearby off-licence and had bought some alcohol to take to the party. So we had CCTV from there. And we also had CCTV which showed the initial group, minus those others that had travelled by train, walking along the Ewell bypass.
We had good, clear CCTV images of their clothing. That fed in nicely to information we were getting from the house-to-house inquiries.
The team now had footage of all the suspects they believed were involved in the fight.
So you've got 3 from that direction, 3 from that direction. They meet together here, they get some beer, they go into a party. Our group is complete. We've got all the people who are described by our witnesses together an hour or 2 before Christopher is murdered.
With the events of Friday night mapped out and evidence tying the suspects to the scene, the team were closing in on the killers.
Once we were able to look at the CCTV footage and take the best still frames that we could to start identifying clothing, it became clear that some of the distinctive clothing that the residents here were telling us they had seen on the assailants when the attack took place, we could see that clothing in our CCTV stills.
With what Colin now felt was enough evidence to definitely link the suspects with the crime, the decision was made to arrest them again. This time, however, the arresting officers also had another objective.
When they were first arrested and we didn't have the information from the eyewitnesses about clothing, then the officers were just looking for the normal sort of things like bloodstained clothing or weapons or that sort of thing. When we went back, we could be much more discriminating about what we took. We knew that we were looking for certain items of clothing, certain distinctive items of clothing that would tie in with what our witnesses were telling us.
If they could find these items, they could tie their named suspects to both the scene of the crime and the witnesses' descriptions.
There were things that were unusual, things that were quite distinctive. A pink polo shirt with a large blue number 2 on the back, a blue and white hooped shirt, a black and white hooped shirt. And so once we found those in the possession of people that we say other people told us were there at the time, then the case begins to mount up.
The prime suspects were again in custody, and this time the police hoped they had enough evidence to charge them with the murder of Christopher Donovan.
After the gang were arrested for the second time, we presented them with the increased amount of evidence that we'd found.
With the new CCTV evidence, the team could show that the suspects were in the area and wearing the clothes seized at their houses.
Each admitted that he had been there, that he'd seen the fight take place, but equally each denied that he'd taken part in the actual assault.
Colin charged their 3 prime suspects with murder. Now he had to convince a jury it was their actions that had killed Christopher. In the early hours of Saturday, the 26th of May, a group of youths had got into a fight with Christopher Donovan, his brother Philip, and a friend in a vicious, unprovoked attack. Christopher later died in hospital before his parents could see him.
You get up in the morning and everything's fine, and then at the end of the day, your whole life has been thrown out the window and you can't get a handle on anything. That's the way it is. It's that quick. Your life is never going to be the same.
An officer had promised the family they would find those responsible, and only 2 days later, DCI Colin Sutton and his team had arrested a number of youths they believed had been responsible for killing Christopher.
So we have 3 charged. Of those, 2 were charged because eyewitnesses had been firm in saying to us the men in the striped t-shirts struck Christopher Donovan, and they had contributed to his death. The 3rd man, wearing the black leather jacket and identifiable because of a baseball cap, had been seen by witnesses to throw a punch. We weren't sure that he'd punched Christopher Donovan. He was actually the only man against whom we got any forensic evidence, because the leather jacket which he was wearing was found to have a speck of blood on its cuff. And that blood came not from Christopher Donovan, but from his brother. Now, legally, there is a rule which is known as joint enterprise. And that says that if you are in a group of people and you together attack somebody else and somebody dies, if you're all in it together, you're all part of the same action in attacking those people, then you are all guilty of whatever consequences come of it. So for that reason, although we only ever proved that this man in the leather jacket had struck Christopher Donovan's brother, he was still able to be charged with the murder.
It was a breakthrough. The police believed they had their killers, but the suspects were denying having worn the incriminating clothes the night of the fight.
Realising that clothing was key to this investigation, we had to devise a system to get that clothing to these different scenes. And how could we do it? What we had to bear in mind was the clothing that had been seized had been to the forensic laboratory. So undertaken tests, we don't know what tests they consisted, chemicals had been used. So therefore it was not practical to expect people to put that clothing on and take them to these scenes. The obvious solution was to get tailors' dummies, mannequins, put them on those, we could bring them to each of the scenes, we could transport them, and we could then use them to show that the clothing we had was the same clothing as the CCTV was showing the group members were wearing at the time.
On the one hand, you have the CCTV image taken on the night that Christopher Donovan was murdered, half an hour before he was murdered. Here are their clothes in front of the same camera at the same time of night, same lighting conditions. Look, it's identical. We've got the right people, we've got their clothes. It's these men that killed him.
Colin was hoping this was what was needed to convince a jury they had the right people, but they had one more piece of evidence to obtain.
There was a question as to whether or not the causation for
Gus Christopher's injuries.
The coroner took over an hour to explain his injuries, because my son Philip wants to know the ins and outs of Duck's backside. And in the end I said, you can just shut up. I just want to see him. I don't want to hear no more. I've had enough. Nearly every bone in his body was broken from the kicking in the car, the brain damage, everything else.
Christopher's brain was examined by the top expert in brain injuries in the country. And the doctors together came to the conclusion that essentially Christopher's injuries from the neck upwards were due to the assault, and all those injuries on his body were due to being dragged along by the car. they were able to make that distinction for us and then go further and say what killed Christopher was the blow to his head. Yes, sadly, Christopher had sustained such severe injuries during the assault that no matter what happened to him after that, he wouldn't have survived. So the car colliding with him and dragging him along the road was completely irrelevant.
Getting this essential evidence meant that Christopher's body could not be released to his parents until after the court case.
So we had to wait nearly a year to go to the Old Bailey. In that time, we buried Chris. And
the initial hearings for the suspects, now named as Stephen Andrews, Ryan Seymour and an unnamed minor, were held in Guildford Crown Court.
The defendants all pleaded not guilty, and eventually, after the normal sort of remands and preliminary hearings, the trial was set for April 2002 at the Old Bailey.
As evidence was presented in the Old Bailey, the suspects continued to insist their innocence.
During the trial, the three accused really had very little contact with each other. They were each blaming each other for the assaults, denying that they were involved. They were going to use a cutthroat defence, which basically means that I don't accept anything, I blame the others. But of course, the danger of a cutthroat defence is that you never know what the other person's going to say against you. We had a situation, for example, they'd gone to London to buy drugs. Initially it was suggested it was cannabis, but in fact one of the defendants, in blaming a co-defendant, said no, the reason we went there was he wanted to get crack. Because he says nobody would go to Clapham Junction to buy cannabis. So we had a situation, whilst they were blaming each other, they were also effectively stabbing each other because they were trying to get themselves off of the murder charge by blaming one of the other defendants.
Christopher's parents were in court for most of the trial.
The hardest is listening to the lies. I was wearing that jacket, no, he was wearing that jacket, and it goes on and on. 6 weeks of lies.
You're putting your trust in the evidence the police have got. You're putting your trust in not just Colin Sutton, the whole of the police.
The time that the foreman stands up and is asked to reveal the verdict is always stressful for everybody.
Not elated, I was just relieved that we'd been able to do a professional job, that we'd been able to establish who was responsible and convince a jury that they were the people who were responsible, that we were able to give Ray, Vi and Philip an idea of exactly what had happened and why it had happened. I was also aware that nobody's a winner here.
With every murder, the whole community is affected. We think that if we live a good life and we're careful, it won't happen to us. Whereas in a case like this, you've got somebody who's just been out with his brother, walking down the road, and that means it could be me. It could happen to me. So there's a real sense of fear in the community that if that happened to them, that happened to their children, it could happen to my child.
While waiting for a sentence, Christopher's parents were taken to the court restaurant.
While we were in the canteen, another father walked in, one of the fathers. And I turned to Vi. As soon as I found guilty, I turned to Vi and said, there's no winners. We all lost today. Everybody's lost a son.
People often say that a court case brings closure to those who have lost a loved one to murder. In my experience, that's not the case. You never have.
And therefore, and after a while, it becomes the normal of not talking.
10 years later, when the sentences had been served, Christopher's parents decided the only way they could make their peace was to meet their son's killers.
First thing I clocked, he had a suit, shirt and tie, polished shoes and a haircut. And I thought, that's respect. As he walked in the room, I stood up and went like that. He came over, put his arms around me and whispered, thank you. He then looked at you, didn't he?
May I hug you? And I can't believe I said yes. It's like he's 26 now, he's not 15 anymore, but he still looks like a little boy. And so we hug and I say, hey young man, do you know that we both forgive you? Move on into the future and have the life Chris can't have. And it's coming out of my mouth and I start feeling it. I really feel it. Like it's gosh. And it was almost like he'd taken a sack of coal off his back and put it down. You could physically see his shoulders go down. And I think we both did the same. It was that instant of humanity.
When the young men were convicted of his murder, there was a certain degree of relief, I think, on the part of Christopher's family that at least justice had been done. But of course, justice being done never brings back your loved one that's been murdered, and they've had to deal with that in the subsequent years and have dealt with it in a remarkable way.
Tonight on Dateline.
When a murder is discovered,
it was right on the sidewalk where the shooting had occurred. The shot came across 3 lanes of traffic as the car was in motion.
it doesn't just destroy one life.
I couldn't understand why. Why would somebody do such a terrible thing?
It tears communities apart.
You can still speak to residents now, and they say they've never got over it. They still feel deep sorrow at what happened to a young man in the midst of their little community here.
It's up to the police to not only solve the mystery.
Our hope is that where we were going was going to provide us with a treasure chest of information.
And track down the killer, but bring them to justice.
The absence of a head or hands can impede identification, but it certainly doesn't make it impossible.
In this episode, the case of a 14-year-old runaway becomes something more sinister.
She was supposed to graduate with us. She may not have been in the same classes as everybody, but she was still one of us. So it was hard.
Meet the murder detectives.
In my 17 years in investigations, I've worked several child abuse cases, both physical and sexual. I've worked a few death investigations. I worked other homicides. But this particular case, to me, is the most important.
Who reveal how they caught the killer.
The polygrapher was asking him questions, and right from the get-go, he was bombing the test. Something terrible.
On either side of the Mississippi River in Illinois lie the towns of Dubuque and East Dubuque. In 2011, a 14-year-old girl called Cheyenne had not turned up at school, and the police had been called.
I first heard of Cheyenne Kersher as a missing person from East Dubuque, Illinois. A report went out to all agencies that she had been reported missing.
Dave Hackmeister was a detective in the Joe Davis County Police Force. Over the next 2 years, Cheyenne's case would involve police from 3 different forces. The initial missing person call came into Chief O'Connell in East Dubuque.
She never came home from school that they knew of. They went out looking and called family and friends and such, and when they couldn't find her on her own, then they called us. And they said that she had run away and that they had a note that she had left in one of their cars.
Chief O'Connell was assisted by East Dubuque patrolman and detective Luke Kovacic.
Chief O'Connell called me and had me come in because we were going to start calling a bunch of friends and family members.
2 of the first people Luke spoke to were Cheyenne's grandparents, Gary and Mary Jo Kircher.
Oh, she was a peach. She was so bubbly. I don't think she had a mean bone in her body.
No.
I mean, she was forever smiling or singing or, stuff like that.
At all, in her birthday. And I told my wife, I said, something's really wrong, because even if she would have ran away, she would have got a phone and called and said, happy birthday, Grandma. And that's when I, kind of felt it was going downhill from that.
So now it's past Halloween, or it was a day after Halloween, and she didn't show up. So at this point, if she's gonna miss that, then I'm thinking that she really doesn't want to be found, or something is now not adding up right.
Cheyenne's case was not the sort of crime the local police were used to dealing with.
It's a river city. The attraction to East Dubuque is the bar closing at 3:30 in the morning. There is a lot of DUIs, there's a lot of bar fights, there's a lot of public intoxes. So that's the stuff that I personally, deal with.
As East Dubuque Police Department was small, the county force also helped out.
Cheyenne Kirschner's case was typically routine, seemingly, and there didn't appear to be any foul play. We did, however, send one of our investigators over to assist East Dubuque.
Never been anywhere.
She loved the library and she loved learning, and the teachers were so good to her. The one time there was a rainstorm, and a lot of kids weren't going to school because it was raining so hard. She walked from where her house is at up to the elementary school in the pouring down rain. She looked like a wet rat, they said, when she came in. The teachers took her off the side. They always have like sweatpants and sweatshirts there, and got her in some dry clothes, got her hair dry, and then put her other stuff in the dryer so when she could go home. But that's how much education meant to her.
We had made a visit to the house, to Cheyenne's house. I did not go in the house at that point in time. I just stayed outside. We also made a visit to the school, and I cleaned out Cheyenne's locker. We kept everything that was in that locker. We also interviewed a guidance counselor.
What I knew about Cheyenne was that she needed some tender care. She was a student who liked attention, maybe not always positive attention. It could have been negative attention. She struggled with some social settings. However, she really wanted to belong. She needed to belong, and she felt very proud that she was going to be a high school student at East Dubuque.
The people at the school were very concerned about the entire situation. We were told by school personnel that Cheyenne's home life wasn't the best.
She lived with her mom and her stepdad, Terry Abbas, and then another adult male that Cheyenne would share was her mom's boyfriend, and then she had an older brother and a younger brother. She seemed always a little disheveled.
Social services were called on the family. As a matter of fact, I had called them at least once myself. She had a heart. I mean, she was genuinely a very good girl. She just was a product of her upbringing.
Cheyenne also had difficulties at school. Classmates like Ashley Herbst were very aware of her problems.
I think she was bullied about her behavior and how she would have outbursts and stuff, and she couldn't control her behavior. And to some kids, that's uncomfortable. And so you might look at that as different.
Concerned Cheyenne could have run away from problems at home, police questioned her family.
I interviewed Cheyenne's mom at the East Dubuque Police Department. An informational interview. It was, let's run through the history of the family, let's run through why Cheyenne might have run away, because at that point, we had the runaway note.
In a case like this, where a child grows up with a very unconventional family and also simply an abusive family, there was living with mother's boyfriend and ex-husband, and when you look at the amount of risk factors that were in this case, you're almost guaranteed that you've got either a future victim or a future offender or somebody that may escape those things but is going to have many issues that they need to overcome, which is quite a bleak.
Where the heck did she go? Did somebody take her? Did she really run away? I couldn't imagine that she ran away, but I had a feeling of urgency. The longer you wait, the less likely of a positive outcome.
We had sightings of Cheyenne, but the 2 years that this case went on, we were never stopped getting reports that Cheyenne was seen. And so we always run to the belief that she was a runaway.
The family believed Cheyenne would one day just return home, but with no solid leads, the police search slowed down.
The East Dubuque Police did everything they could do and beyond.
At this point, Dave Hackmeister from Joe Davis County Police Force was setting up a critical incident response team to deal with unsolved cases.
The Cheyenne Kirschner case became very important to us because it was a 14-year-old girl that had been missing for a year and a half and had not been heard from. So we picked it up as a cold case in hopes of finding her alive, possibly hiding from some realities in her home.
Cheyenne was well known in the community, and officers from many police forces in the area signed up. One of them was Eric Heffel from neighbouring Galena.
talked about her not having a lot of resources. She didn't have money. She didn't have a whole lot of even friends, unfortunately, to help her out. We talked about the fact that there was a runaway note. Did she write it? Did somebody make her write it? And there's a lot of different scenarios that could have played out that we talked about that way.
It was around the end of August, beginning of September. I got a telephone call from the FBI agent on the team, and he had gone up to La Crosse, Wisconsin to interview, at that time, Cheyenne's best friend. He got done with the interview and he called me, and the first words out of his mouth, I'll never forget, were, "Casey, she's dead. I know she's dead."
Come to the police department.
As time went by, we did balloon releases and stuff to always remember her. There was a lot of search parties going on trying to find her and stuff. It was kind of hard for students to even really grasp what was going on.
Cheyenne's family were still hoping that the teenager would just turn up, but were beginning to fear the worst.
Well, I was hoping that she did run away. She would have at least phoned me or something. So I just was hoping that she did have enough of that family and did run away.
Because the alternative is real hard to accept.
I would actually expect somebody like this girl to run away. She fits all the high-risk categories for somebody who'd be a missing person. The thing that would be unusual is the fact that there was nothing. There was no trace of her. The fact that you have her there one day and her gone with nothing, no phone calls, no contact with friends, that's the bit that's unusual.
Hope of finding Cheyenne soon vanished when one of the new police team interviewed her best friend at school.
He said she was emotional. He said she was a wreck. She had not heard from Cheyenne once in that entire time she was gone. Not once. So that was the turning point in my mind that now we need to start focusing on this other aspect that Cheyenne's been murdered.
Lead detective Dave Hackmeister was no longer treating this as a case of a runaway teenager.
Once we ruled out the fact in our minds that she was a runaway, we honestly felt that the worst had happened, that she was deceased. And now it was up to us to find out who in the family might have participated, if they all knew about it, if anyone was involved in the family.
Cheyenne had shared her home with her mum, her stepdad, and her mum's boyfriend, as well as her two brothers.
The family was a little bit unusual. They were, I hate to go as far as saying a dysfunctional family, but not your typical family. And the house was a terrible mess.
According to friends, Cheyenne used to spend as little time as possible at home. Greg Herbst was the superintendent at her high school.
Because Cheyenne's life was somewhat unconventional, I don't know that people had their red flags up at first. It wasn't until after time started to lapse that people started to wonder if there was more to this.
Although Cheyenne had the surname Kircher, her father, as named on her birth certificate, wasn't her biological father. He and Cheyenne's mother separated when she was 8.
Her biological dad, I don't think anybody knows who he is. Cheyenne's last name of Kircher is from a person, he put his name on the birth certificate, but later on in life found out that he was not her biological father. From the history I would gather from records and from Cheyenne, Terry Abbas was the closest thing she knew to a father besides the person she had previously known as her father for the first 8 years of her life.
Even though it had been almost 2 years since Cheyenne had last been seen, the new task force started from scratch in tracing her last movements.
We talked to a lot of people that had stated they had seen Cheyenne. We had a psychic call in. We had numerous people we spoke to across the river, which is Dubuque, Iowa, that knew her. We tried to run down every lead or every tip that we possibly had at that time.
Although a bit of a loner at school, Cheyenne had been very active on social media, so the team looked online for clues.
Cheyenne had been on the internet speaking with older men, so that was a concern of ours. The FBI then sent to these various locations, and they were multi-states. It was from Florida to Texas to Alaska. We found no evidence at all that even though she had communicated with a few of these people, that they were involved in the case. What we determined was that no one, to the best of our knowledge, had ever seen Cheyenne Kirscher since she went missing. But we needed to refocus and take a look at the family and see if in any way that they were involved in her disappearance. The mom was a suspect, the mom's boyfriend was a suspect, but we were kind of keying in on Terry Abbas, the husband.
When Cheyenne came to school, she would tell me a lot about her home life. One time her stepdad, she called him Terry. And she was very upset because she got home from school and her mom was at work and he was on the computer. He was looking up porn and other girls, and she threatened to tell her mom on him. It was just not a very functional, normal family life.
The team began to focus their investigation on finding out more about Cheyenne's relationship with her stepfather.
During the course of the investigation, I had learned that Cheyenne had disclosed to some of her friends that Terry Abbas had been sexually abusing her.
He definitely gave me the creeps, and probably every staff member here the creeps. I mean, there was just, you could just tell there was something not right about him.
Although there was no proof Terry Abbas sexually abused Cheyenne, the police were convinced he had been a threat to her. He became their #1 suspect.
We're a little bit concerned of a couple of things. Number one, that he might flee. Number two, we're hopeful that he might trip himself up if he's really nervous about our investigation, and he might go back to the scene of the crime. If he did in fact murder Cheyenne, he might try to move the body or conceal it more than it is.
They decided they needed to follow Terry Abbas's every move, however they could.
We did not have surveillance on Mr. Abbas. Unfortunately, we just didn't have the manpower to do it. That was one of the reasons we wanted the tracking device to see where he would go if he would flee. But we also were of the mind that he wants to keep up the illusion that he's still cooperating. And so he's not going to go anywhere. He's going to stick it out as long as he possibly can.
Certain Terry Abbas knew something about Cheyenne's disappearance, the task force agreed to place a tracker on his car.
The family was a family of campers, so they had a variety of different locations that they would camp at in the woods. And we thought, hey, if he did in fact kill little Cheyenne, that might be one place that we might want to be interested in looking at. So we were hopeful that he would lead us to a place like that.
So we placed the tracking device on the vehicle. So I fire up the computer. I'm anxious to see, where's this guy going? What's he doing? So I had followed him. He was tracked from his house. I believe he went to a gas station, and then he's going across the bridge into Iowa, and the tracking signal stopped. Just stopped dead.
Police suspected East Dubuque teenager Cheyenne Kirscher had been killed by her stepfather, Terry Abbas. They had placed a tracker on his car, but the signal had suddenly stopped.
And I'm like, okay, what happened? Did he find the tracking device and throw it in the Mississippi River? Was my first thought.
Whether it was removed or fell off, the tracker was no use. The team decided they now needed to confront the family with the possibility that Cheyenne had been murdered.
We don't have any other evidence going for us. This is a confession case. You know, it's either a confession or somehow we stumble across her body. So we decided as a group, we're going to bring them in, interview all of them at one time in separate rooms, and after our interviews, send them on to a polygrapher, and felt that that was our best option.
I believe it was September 4th. The family members of Cheyenne come in, and they all came in at the same time. The only person who didn't show up at that particular time was Terry Abbas. Didn't show up for the interview.
Terry Abbas' excuse was, I believe he had to work. He had other engagements.
Someone who doesn't show up when everyone else is participating, to me, is a big red flag. And there's a reason he doesn't want to be there. Polygraph examination, giving 3 polygraph tests at exactly the same time.
I spoke to Mr. Abbas on the way for him to take his test. And at that time, he seemed fairly calm, talked about work to me.
It was definitely intentional to let him know that we were going to have a polygrapher waiting after the interview. We want to put as much mental pressure and police presence in their mind as possible. We separated them, we interviewed them all. Mom, the boyfriend, and the brother were seemingly pretty upfront. On the other hand, Terry was again very aloof and just giving very basic answers and not being as specific as we thought he should be. After the conclusion of our interviews, went to the polygraphers.
Lie detectors don't really work by detecting lies. They're flawed, they can be triggered by all sorts of things. However, the technology itself tends to be very intimidating. And to someone who is of average intelligence would feel that they're giving themselves away. And often they will just confess because they believe that thing can actually almost read their mind.
This was crunch time. The team were hoping the pressure of the lie detector would make Abbas crack.
The polygrapher was working with him, asking him questions, and right from the get-go, other than the controlled questions about his name and date of birth and things like that, he was bombing the test. Something terrible.
The FBI agent carrying out the test informed Abbas that the machine was showing he was lying.
He told Terry that things aren't going well. You're not showing that these are honest answers. And he couldn't lie himself out of this.
Abbas was taken out of the room and placed into another interview room with a video camera.
We decided we're going to put Terry Abbas in the videoed interview room because he's most likely the one that would be our offender. And if he confesses, we want to have it on video.
Well, you got your man. Hey, you got Terry Abbas. Cheyenne is not with us, she's gone.
During Terry Abbas's initial confession, he told Wayne that he had taken Cheyenne up into the woods behind the house and that they were running around. Cheyenne wanted him to chase her through the woods, which he did, and he was slipping and sliding all over the place. And after he had slipped and fallen, at some point in time, he just blacked out. And the next thing he knew, he woke up and he came to, and Cheyenne was dead, and his hand was wrapped around her neck.
Before I knew it, I was standing over a body.
What I can see from this case and the actions of this man prior, during and post the offence, I actually think he was crying for himself that day and crying that he had not got away with it and actually wasn't showing any genuine emotion for his victim at all.
But my life is over. It's been over for a long time. I just didn't have a face to reality. We'll work through all that.
Terry Abbas told the FBI agent that he had had sex with Cheyenne Kirscher outside the home in the backyard. And following a sexual act, he strangled her. He had strangled her to death.
Last time I remember, my hand was over her neck for some reason. Just over her neck, doing what? Squeezing, I guess. And I panicked. What happened to cause that? I have no clue.
He had stated that he had dug a hole. It was a fairly deep hole, that he did it by himself. He had lured Cheyenne up there, put her in the hole.
So during that interview with Terry Abbas, he was asked if he would take us to the gravesite of where he had buried Cheyenne, which he agreed to do.
With Abbas's confession, the team had their killer, and the news began to spread.
And next thing I knew, I got a phone call from Loopy. He said, "You're not gonna believe it, Chief," but he said, "Terry just admitted that he killed her."
It was a feeling, it's kind of hard to describe because I knew Cheyenne personally. We all feel the same way because we have kids. When you know a child has indeed been forced to do sexual stuff and then murdered. But yet we were to it.
I firmly believe that she felt her daughter was alive. For the almost 2 years that this case went on, I think that she really believed that Cheyenne was just someplace with somebody and was being taken care of, and when she was ready to come.
Terry Abbas assaulted Cheyenne Kircher. He assaulted an entire community because small towns have an inherent tranquility about them, and he disrupted that. He assaulted the tranquility of this wonderful town.
With everyone involved still in shock, the task force began the task of finding Cheyenne's body.
Cheyenne Kircher lived directly across the street from this building, which is an elementary school. It was so close to the location where she was killed, it's really unbelievable. It's hard to imagine that someone could do that, being this close to not only a school filled with kids, but a fairly busy roadway.
In 2013, 14-year-old Cheyenne Kircher had been missing for almost 2 years, but under police questioning, her stepfather Terry Abbas had admitted to sexually assaulting her and strangling her.
It was 23 months of not knowing. You need closure, but under these circumstances, that's not the best closure. I mean, I was hoping she ran away, and then you find out what really happened. You read it in books, you see it in TV shows and everything else, but until it happens to your family, it's really tough. There isn't a day go by that you don't remember something.
The police had their killer, but had yet to find Cheyenne's body. They took Abbas to the woodland where he said he killed Cheyenne and asked him to show them where she was.
On September 18th, shortly after Terry Abbas confessed to the killing of Cheyenne Kircher, he brought the investigators over to this location.
Terry Abbas then walks us up a steep embankment into the woods, and as we're looking for the grave, he's looking around, he's handcuffed, and he kind of walks past it. And so I see this depression in the ground, and when you fill in a hole, dirt will sink down in. And I see a depression in the ground, and I pointed to him, I said, "Terry, is this it here?"
Terry, why don't you take a good look at this? It's hard. Is this where Cheyenne is? Yes, that's where Cheyenne is. And how did she get by this?
The gravesite was very difficult to see. As you can notice, there's heavy underbrush over there. However, he took us very close to where he thought that he had buried the body. It was a good starting point for us. We were very confident at that time that this was the location that we had to start the excavation.
About how far down do you think she is? About 45 foot. And this was a hole that you had dug? Yes. Did anyone help you put her in there? No. You did this by yourself? Yes.
At this point, my feelings are all over the place. I am excited that we've caught the killer. Feeling overwhelmed at the work that I know needs to come. I'm feeling sadness for Cheyenne because she's been alone in this grave for 18 months and nobody knew where she was.
From there, we came down, we called in some of our assist units who roped off the area, and we had to wait until the next day to start our excavation.
The fact that he was willing to kill her, to murder her, to get away with sexual abuse suggests that he's not just a very dangerous sex offender, he's also a very dangerous violent offender, likely to be very cold, calculated, potentially has some personality flaws that makes him very narcissistic or very antisocial.
Although Abbas had confessed, the team needed to determine how Cheyenne had died and see if Abbas's story matched the facts.
Next day, we had state police and FBI forensics come in. The crime scene people roped off everything and started the excavation of the body.
But after some time digging, the team found nothing.
On Friday, following Terry Abbas's arrest, we were well into the excavation of Cheyenne's grave at that point. We were digging, and we weren't finding anything. And I was getting a little nervous. The FBI agent on the team came up to me and he's like, "Hey, we just got a call from the jail. Terry Abbas wants to talk."
Abbas was a feckless, psychopathic paedophile. He was somebody who had a continuous career of endangering others, which made him very, very good at concealing his activities, very good at lying, very good at covering things up, just as he covered up the grave.
Some things don't make sense, according to what we talked about the other day. So I'd like you to tell us a little bit more about what happened that day. Things just don't add up.
Casey was hoping Abbas would now tell them why they weren't finding Cheyenne.
During that interview, it was about 30 minutes into it, when he confessed that he had actually dug the grave the day before, giving us premeditation for the murder.
She didn't even see the hole up there. I got lucky on that part, I guess.
Abbas was changing his story from the one he had told in his confession. But he didn't stop with the grave. He also solved one of the biggest problems the team had faced when Cheyenne went missing.
During that second interview, we were able to get from him that he had Cheyenne write the note about a month before the murder actually happened. He said that the note was actually going to be a practical joke that he and Cheyenne were going to pull on Cheyenne's mom, that Cheyenne had run away. That's when he started to formulate his plan of killing Cheyenne. What I believe happened is he had been sexually abusing Cheyenne for many years, and that Cheyenne had already sort of told on him in July and maybe had threatened to tell more people about the sexual abuse that he was doing to her. And so he had to eliminate the problem. And so he forms this plan in his mind. Now he's got a note in Cheyenne's handwriting that he can plant after he kills her to throw the police off the trail, which early on is exactly what happened.
That he can go to that extreme measure, not do what most sex offenders would do, which would be to groom the person, threaten the person, make it that that person is very scared to tell somebody. But he took it to the extreme of getting rid of the person who could get him into trouble. But it suggests a lot about his personality.
Working with Abbas's new information, the forensics team finally found Cheyenne.
I was there when the body's excavated. We were going down 2 or 3 feet and there was nothing, and we weren't sure if that was even going to be the exact spot. And then one of the FBI evidence technicians stated they had found a little, like they called them friendship bracelets, but we had found out through our investigation that she said she wore that bracelet to keep the demons away at night. And there was pictures of her wearing this black and white bracelet. So when they found that, we knew then that we were in the right spot. We just needed to go a little deeper.
Once Cheyenne's body was exhumed, we were all very confident that the work that we had done was definitely more than sufficient for court purposes. I didn't see how he was going to get out of this at all. I mean, very good, solid case.
The team now had all the evidence they needed to put Abbas away for the murder of Cheyenne.
So it was just under 2 years. And for 2 years, she was probably less than 100 yards from her mom's house. She was buried in a grave on a hillside in a wooded area, a place that nobody would probably go to but Cheyenne.
He had actually started digging the grave a day early. Took cigarette breaks, supposedly went down and checked on his son down at the house. How can somebody be that cold? I want to see that sucker suffer, not just be sitting in a cell and, staring at 4 walls for the rest of his life. That isn't fair. A lot of states do not have the death penalty, but I think there should be a little window that if something like this, or a baby, or any of these, that's different. Then they should get the gas chamber, whatever that state has.
He was charged with murder. He confessed and he pled guilty. And when most people are still trying to raise bond to get out on a crime, he was trying to plead and go to prison. I mean, he wanted it over with as fast as he could get it over with.
Cheyenne's killer had been caught, and in downtown East Dubuque, 40-year-old Terry Abbas went to court charged with her murder.
Terry's first court appearance, he decided that he did not want an attorney, that he was going to be his own attorney. The judge had told him to really think about that hard.
I just remember the feeling of being in the courtroom with Terry. I think some people wanted to actually just maybe visualize what he's like, to see what kind of person could do something like that to a child.
As Abbas pleaded guilty, the court case was over quickly, but it revealed the details of Cheyenne's death to the rest of the town.
I was asked,
especially being 14.
I think about Cheyenne every day, pretty close to every day, if not multiple times a day, because every time I come into this office, or every time I file something.
The result of the court hearings was Terry Abbas was convicted, and he was punished to life imprisonment without parole in the state of Illinois.
television will sometimes portray that there is an honor code in prisons and that crimes against children are frowned upon. So it is my hope that Mr. Abbas is having this code of honor imposed upon him every day for the rest of his life. If that sounds cold to some, I don't apologize, because he sexually assaulted and murdered a 14-year-old girl.
The whole community was in.
This case with Cheyenne Kirscher was a tragic case. We all look back at it and we think, you know, how did we miss this? How did society miss this? You think to yourself, how many others are out there? It took us 2.5 years to resolve this. Something started out as a simple missing person or runaway. It happens to thousands of young girls and boys throughout our country. We need to look more closely at how we can communicate and really begin our investigation sooner than we do.